Hi everybody, welcome to the session today. Thank you for coming along. Welcome to what is now the final week of the Creative Industries Festival. We've been going all the way through May and we're nearly at the end now. Tomorrow's event is going to be our closing event with the musician Kate Nash, so do try and come on to that if you can. So all of this week we've been focusing on music and sound, and today's event is a conversation between Patrick Farmer and Rebekah Alero, who are on screen here, and their fascinating Dandelion Project, which is an archive created by Rebekah, particularly for experimental artists of colour. And as such, it resonates really nicely with what's become kind of a key theme of the festival as a whole, which is how do we ensure that the creative industries become better at remembering the contributions made by overlooked and marginalised artists in order to support and nurture future artists and producers. Just a couple of housekeeping notices. The meeting's been recorded, so if you don't want to feature in the recording, which will become available on our website hopefully very soon, you can keep your camera off and then you will not feature in the recording. You can still communicate with us via the chat, so introduce yourself, ask any questions, have discussions amongst yourself if you like. That's always quite nice to see when people are engaging in that way, so please do use the chat. Really, that's going to be it for me for today. I'll just quickly introduce Patrick. Patrick Farmer is a writer and a composer. He's co-founder of Compost and Height, editor of the new music journal Wolf Notes, founder of the Sound in Particular lecture series and Significant Landscapes Festival, and also curator of the Audiograph Festival, which is hosted here at Brookes as well. So I'll hand over to Patrick and take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, James, and hello, everyone. Whenever my biography is kind of announced like that, I'm always reminded, I always want to change it. An old biography of mine literally just used to say, likes jumping. And I took that off because I was very embarrassed by it, but I feel like hearing that said out loud in the current context would be much more enjoyable. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. And thank you to James and Maya and Daniela for organizing this series of events. This is a discussion, as James said, primarily about Rebekah's Dandelion Project Archive. Also, I'll just do a few introductions. I'll introduce Rebekah. I'll introduce a little bit to do with the Sonic Art Research Unit and the Audiograph Festival, where part of Rebekah's work is currently being shown. So Rebekah is sound artist and composer working in a variety of modes, such as graphic scores, video, and still image. And these modes, sort of in conjunction, often sort of lead to explorations of the capacities of such things as documentation and research in relation to their own kind of mode and process of self-reflexivity. They are currently focusing on the narrative of Blackness within the context of archiving, exploring ways in which their findings can be saved and preserved. So Rebekah's sound works and compositions in this way kind of focus on the voice and the use of both digital and analog experimentations, with particular interest and influence in the realm of sonic hauntology. So the Sonic Art Research Unit, which is based at Oxford Brookes, it's very hard to introduce. It's very hard to know what to say about it because it's a very amorphous entity. It's one that remains, as far as possible to do so, it's one that remains open to a wide array of possibilities. And this manifests, I hope, and will continue to do so, in a kind of a variety of different collaborations and projects and exchanges. And, the SARU is run by myself, by Paul Whitty, and by Matt Parker. So I only really, just by way of context, I thought it would be good to just briefly introduce one of those projects, which is the Audiograph Festival. And this is the annual festival of experimental music and sound art and much, much more besides. And this year, of course, the festival was all online, but it was I thought it was going to be really difficult, a real sort of, really, really sort of hard to adjust to that kind of paradigm shift, but it was actually a really great experience developing the festival this year in collaboration with everyone. And one of the most exciting and vital elements was Rebekah's Dandelion Project Archive, which I feel is really best introduced by Rebekah themselves. But for now, I just wanted to wrap this up and say that, we were lucky enough to be able to release a different part of Rebekah's work in this regard every day as part of the festival over a period of 5 days, and some of which I'm very pleased to say we'll get to experience during this next hour. So hello, Rebekah. It's lovely to see you as always. Before we start, I was wondering if there's anything you wanted to say or whether we should just jump right in.
Yeah, I think let's jump right in. Yeah, I think you've that was a fantastic intro. Thanks for that. So yeah, let's just go right into it, I think.
So I thought a good way to begin would be, for you to tell everyone a little bit about your background and about the things and the events that led you to composing, but not only led you there, but, the things that keep you there, the things that sustain you moment by moment in this regard.
What first got me into even the term composer was my love of film scores. I initially wanted to be a film score composer. That was like my whole thing. From obviously when I was a child, just playing the piano and having this like scene in my head. It was all like visual and like sound together. But alongside that, of course, I was a bass player and I was a poet. I was a spoken word poet. And then gradually, as I started working with sound and words, poetry started to kind of become a back burner to the point of like not really existing anymore. And I was focusing on sound. And I started to push how I created sound beyond. I think it was because I was self-taught at so many of the instruments that I was playing, mainly bass and piano. I realized that there was a bit of a wall in terms of my understanding of music in that kind of, in the score, which I didn't know. I kind of made my own scores and stuff, which I think enabled me to experimental sides of music where I didn't need to necessarily have this theory, music theory in my head all the time. And then of course that when I started at Guildhall, that was catered to so much because of the course I was on. And that pushed me even deeper into creating sound and being a composer that I am now. I'm working with the voice and of course now synthesizers and graphic scores and everything. It's just, completely opened up. Actually got one of the pace tutors here, Hannah. Hi. So yeah, that's kind of a very brief introduction of how I got into composition.
Oh, no, amazing, thank you. And I really like that, the way you phrased that, this kind of this notion of a wall that you come across, but it's this very kind of collision or rubbing against such a kind of a solid substance that leads you to begin to make your own scores. And I feel like that actually leads quite nicely into another question in relation to the Dandelion Project Archive in general. So it would be lovely to hear more about the archive. I mean, I know that's a very multifaceted question that can go in any number of directions, but I feel that's entirely the point, in that by sort of asking you to tell us a little bit more about the archive, it also, I feel, sort of engenders a question about the influences and experiences that you feel have been formative in the development, not only of the archive, but in relation to your own work and your own outlook.
Yeah, so I think I should say, like, archiving, before this project came to be, I wasn't like a huge fan of like archiving. I wasn't going down to all of the archive spaces. I wasn't, I have no knowledge of like how archiving should be. I think it came to me, archiving came into this context because there was a lack of something. There wasn't a container for my work, and soon we'll get into Julius Eastman's work as well, and so many other Black composers like myself, classical, experimental, like making these sort of work. There wasn't like a space that I could go to to research deeper, or just there wasn't like a one space that I could have a draw source from. So initially the project started from my research into Julius Eastman, who is a composer, a Black classical composer, and how hard it was. Like his work, everything about him was just scattered all over the place, and it was just very small things. A lot of things were being repeated, and it was very hard to gather and contain everything. But then, from my own experience, I did a BA at Guildhall, which is called Performance and Creative Enterprise, and it has a very big reliance on. Sorry, on. I hope you can still hear me. A really big reliance on self-reflections, documenting yourself in any process, you know, be it like really small things or really big things to do with your practice, which I'd never really came across, especially in an institution where it was like such a huge part of your learning and growth as an artist, and like the conversations we'd have with our tutors about our practice and where we'd like it to go and stuff like that. So I think with that knowledge of doing it for myself, I realized how important it was to create that container broadly with whoever I collaborate with within the Dandelion Project and whoever goes into the archive. And of course it started with myself, and of course it started off with Julius Eastman, because those are the two main things that I felt needed a container, and to maybe be an example of what else could also be contained within the archive as well.
Yeah, the way you sort of phrased this notion of archiving becoming a necessity because of the very lack of archiving is a really interesting premise, and, you know, really vital sort of premise, of one that's of extreme importance. And so just to step back a little bit then, I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about Julius Eastman, about what it was that drew you to him, you know, where him in this sense is not something that can be defined by kind of a singular experience, a singular identity. But not only what drew you to Eastman, but maybe like, yeah, speaking a bit about his life and his work, and the sort of, you know, maybe if you're okay with this, a little bit more about the difficulties you mentioned with regard to actually uncovering or encountering these parts of Eastman's life that, you know, contextually speaking, sort of provided a basis for the development of the archive.
Yeah. So yeah, starting off with, like, of course, like Julius Eastman's work is, of course, his work is just so profound. Like it rests within classical music, but it doesn't. And I think it's easy to call it minimalism, but I think it probably really isn't. But of course, one of the main things that I read about him was his story of like someone that made such beautiful pieces of work, and had such beautiful things to say, was all of a sudden just like almost erased from this area of music. Like there's like a huge gap. It's like, but someone that felt so important, there's like not much that exists. And though I don't want this to be the main preface of Julius Eastman, but the way he died as well also feels so severe and quite violent in terms of him in classical music as well. It's like, how there's so many questions, like how could this happen? So I think initially that's what drew me into it. But then the more I got deeper into his work, the more I realized how much it resonated with my own experience in institutions. I mean, not in necessarily such a violent way, but more being on the outskirts of classical music, being in an institution like Guildhall. Although I did feel safe within my course, I noticed that there was a lot of similarities in our experiences, possibly. I mean, Eastman's not here for us to have that conversation with, unfortunately. And of course, like hearing him speaking about his experience in the language of classical music. He used that language, of the way he scored, of coining this term organic music, similar to John Cage and Steve Reich, having all these different new, almost mathematical ways of making music. And then having his series called the Nigger series as well, which speaks on those pieces alone is like a narrative of maybe his experience as a Black man in classical music, as a Black man in New York in those times. And it was like, oh my God, like this exists in classical music. Like it really hit home for me, and it made me feel like it was like a huge representation of what could be and what existed before Julius Eastman as well in this area of music. And I think it solidified my space within even being able to talk about or make work similar to what Eastman was making, which is classical music, or again using the language of classical music in my own work.
Yeah, thank you, Rebekah. I mean, I feel like it'd be a good time soon to sort of start to play some of your work. But before we do, what you were just speaking about with regard to a timeline, the kind of the lateral nature of this, it made me think of a book that you and I have discussed together before, Dylan Robinson's Hungry Listening, the resonant theory for Indigenous sound studies, which I have here in front of me now. If anyone is interested in this book and hasn't come across it before, I highly recommend it for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that Robinson writes about in this book is inclusion, about how Indigenous performers are often offered, I'm thinking in particular with what you were saying about Eastman's sort of utilization of a classical music vocabulary and this kind of language. And so Robinson, he speaks in a similar fashion about Ben Patterson, the flux, the musician so often associated with Fluxus, but whom was often erased from that kind of history of the movement. And so he speaks about inclusion and about how Indigenous performers are often offered space within a composition, within that kind of framework, within the classical, traditional Western classical framework. But, he says, of course, that such musicians, such performers are rarely offered the opportunity to define the structure, to define the kind of the ethics, the aesthetics of this performance any further, and, states that this inclusion is essentially performs the opposite of its enunciation. And so you were speaking about Eastman's sort of involvement in the classical music world of this time, and I was wondering if you could maybe speak about this a little bit in light of speak about his spoken introduction at Northwestern University in the early 80s, but also speak about this kind of notion of inclusion, perhaps, with regard to the kind of the socio-political elements surrounding the need and the importance for this introduction, which I will link to now as well, if anyone's interested.
Yeah, I think, again, classical, my experience of classical music anyway, is that it's performed, it's very uniformed, it's performed, and these are the instruments, and this is the composer, and possibly this is the conductor, and that's really it. And then maybe somewhere along history there is this quite important story that's told about it, but again, it's like you never really hear it straight from the source, possibly. This spoken introduction, which actually came about because there was a bit of uproar about Eastman using the N-word in the titles of his pieces, and there were complaints about at the Northwestern University, like, oh my goodness, he can't say these words. This is at the height of racism in institutions as well. It was kind of like, okay, he needs to explain himself, which I'm so thankful he did. And without even saying the words racism or speaking on those sort of particular experiences, he speaks about the pieces and what they stand for in such a beautiful way, and I think, I'm loosely paraphrasing, one of the phrases that stood out for me was when he says, if there is a cause, and if it is a great cause, those who belong to that cause will sacrifice their blood. And I feel like Eastman put himself on the front line in a way. Even he's got the piece Gay Gorilla as well. And I think he speaks about putting his physical self on the front line of everything that he does, of being unapologetically Black and unapologetically gay. He speaks of that within the spaces of classical music, of all these people that have probably never even heard such things before. And then to play these amazing pieces of music. I'm wondering if we could even listen to a bit of it together now, but if we don't have time, that's fine. So yeah, I think that spoken introduction just is such a profound moment. I think in the realms of contemporary classical or classical, to hear that from a composer, and it might guide the listener of the pieces in a different direction of what sound and music can do. Especially, it's like it says so many things, and then you hear the intensity of these series of music, of these pieces of music, and it's like, okay, you can hear that narrative almost again, which is why this spoken introduction is so important. Yeah, I really encourage people to listen to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we certainly have the time. I mean, it's what is it? It's 6.5 minutes long. I mean, it's up to you, Rebekah. I'm very happy to just.
Please, yeah,
great.
Yeah, let's do it.
I'll just. Okay.
I want to say a few words about the music. Number one is there are 3 pieces on the program. The first is called Evil Nigger, and the second is called Gay Gorilla, and the third is called Crazy Nigger. Now, these are 3 pieces that can be played by any number of instruments. Just for the reason I have them for pianos here is because for practical reason, one can play this piece therefore with just 4 people and then 4 pianos. But if melody instruments were playing, probably a good number would be somewhere in the area of maybe 10 instruments, 10 to 18 instruments, usually of the same family. So therefore, another version could be for, let's say, 18 stringed instruments. These particular pieces formally are an attempt to what I call make organic music. That is to say, the third part of any part, of the third measure or the third section, the third part, has to contain all of the information of the first 2 parts and then go on from there. So therefore, unlike romantic music or classical music where you have actually different sections, and you have these sections which, for instance, are in great contrast to the first section or to some other section in the piece, these pieces, they're not exactly perfect yet. They're not perfect. But there's an attempt to make every section contain all of the information of the previous sections, or else taking out information at a gradual and logical rate. Now, there was a little problem with the titles of the piece. There were some students and one faculty member who felt that the titles were somehow derogatory in some manner, being that the word nigger is in it. These particular titles, the reason I use them is because, in fact, there's a whole series of these pieces, and they're called, we call it nigger series. Now, the reason I use that particular word is because, for me, it has what I call a basicness about it. That is to say, I feel that in any case, the first niggers were, of course, field niggers. And upon that is really the basis of what I call the American economic system. Without field niggers, you wouldn't really have such a great and grand economy that we have. So that is what I call the first and great nigger, field niggers. And what I mean by niggers is that thing which is fundamental, that person or thing that attains to a basicness, a fundamentalness, and eschews that thing which is superficial or what can we say, elegant. So that, a nigger for me is that kind of thing which attains himself or herself to the ground of anything, you see, and that's what I mean by nigger. So there are many niggers. There are many kinds of niggers. There are of course 99 names of Allah, but then there are 52 niggers, and so therefore we are playing two of these niggers. Now the reason I use gay gorilla, Guerrilla, that one, is because these names, let me put a little subsystem here. These names, either I glorify them or they glorify me. And in the case of gorilla, that glorifies gay. That's to say, there aren't many gay gorillas. I don't feel that gaydom does have that strength. So therefore, I use that word in the hopes that they will. You see, at this point, I don't feel that gay gorillas can really match with Afghani gorillas or PLO gorillas. But let us hope in the future that they might. You see, that's why I use that word gorilla. It means a gorilla is someone who is, in any case, sacrificing his life for a point of view. And you know, if there is a cause, and if it is a great cause, those who belong to that cause will sacrifice their blood, because without blood there is no cause. So therefore, that is the reason that I use gay gorilla, in hopes that I might be one, if called upon to be one.
Cool. Yeah. So just hearing that again was it's great. It's so weird listening to that and then not hearing everyone's thoughts straight away. But again, hearing it back again, and I just think it was just so well articulated in how he was able to talk about reflecting back this. He was reflecting back, or in a way, America, and the way America treated Blackness, and that the history of Blackness. He's putting a mirror back up against the country and saying it for exactly as it is, and again talking about how he is putting himself on the front line to reflect that back and just to lay it out in such a matter-of-fact way. And of course the last phrase that he says, which is just so powerful, and I think it's almost impossible for anyone that gets into the depths of researching Julius Eastman to not feel like this is their cause. They've been given a reason to delve in, and I think that's why he's so important for the Dandelion Project. He is essentially the seeds of the project, because he is the cause that has shone a light on not only him and what happened to him in terms of being preserved, but all the Black composers that came before him as well, and in a way those that have come after him. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Rebekah. It's so great to have an opportunity to hear your responses to this. And it's funny because, I mean, I just used the word responses, you use the word reflective. And so, you were talking about sort of reflecting back the kind of, the American tendency, the notion that the wall you mentioned earlier is also this mirror. And it's these words now, reflecting, responding, which sort of take me to one of your pieces that was made available during Audiographed. And if it's okay with you, I'd like to sort of maybe read a little bit of your text that accompanied that piece, and then sort of maybe talk about it a little bit and then play it, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'll share my screen in a moment, but so the piece is Re. And as I was going, I mentioned to you earlier that, there's all of these strange kind of like listening modalities at work here. And I'm finally at a point now after the festival where I can really just absolutely listen to what the piece has to say. Like there's no other point between me and the piece. And Re in particular really struck me, not only the piece itself, but the sort of the accompanying text. And if I can just read a little bit, you write that, Re stands for reborn, rebirth, redoing, recognizing, responding. All the Re's standing for this, first gaining knowledge and having a new state of being that is a response or related to a singular or a series of experiences. And it's interesting, the kind of the composite nature of reflection, because I sort of, as I was listening back through this morning, I felt like revelation was something I really sort of, I felt quite firmly in my gut when listening, because it began to kind of, the experience began to kind of integrate the work of Anne Carson and Fred Moten in my mind in a sort of in a contextual response. And in particular, it was Anne Carson's often overlooked essay, The Gender of Sound, which, as I mentioned earlier, as far as I'm aware, it was published in an early version of one of her books, Glass, Irony and God, but has since been taken out of that book. And I'm not entirely, I'm not au fait as to why, but it's still a kind of a strangely ironic curiosity. And in this essay, Carson sort of, wonders if there might not be another idea of human order other than repression, and another notion of virtue other than self-control, a kind of another human essence other than the self. And this sort of, this came to mind as I was listening, and immediately something that Fred Moten wrote about in his book Black and Blur started to kind of come to the surface as well, in this sort of the way that Moten speaks about an open set of sentences of blackness as X, and that, we should chant these sentences, not only for the kind of the residual critique of such things, of where they've come from and where they're going, where they are, but also in kind of like devoted sustenance and defense of, what Moten calls the irregular. So it's up to you in what order we do this, but I was wondering, with all this being said, if you'd like to speak a little bit more about this, particularly with regard to your own ideas of gender in relation to Eastman's story.
I think we should, if we can read it and listen, and then we can get into it after. Just, yeah.
It'll take a second. I just have to find the right one. I should have had this queued up beforehand. Here we are.
Yeah, nice. So yeah, with this piece, it was yeah, even just listening to it back and reading what I wrote again, it's this state of being uncomfortable. It's deeply uncomfortable. It was deeply uncomfortable at first to go into the pieces of the Nigger series of Eastman's work, and it was uncomfortable for me to go to that place with my voice. And like you said, there was a shedding of something that had to be done in order for me to access certain things. It was beyond, you know, because I exist as a Black person. Julius Eastman was Black. It was beyond accessing those parts of pure oppression and that, you know, what everyone kind of knows what comes with being Black in these spaces. In order for me to access that part of my voice, I had to also shed a gender in a way. And again, that's why, you know, I speak about being non-binary, being closely linked to the vocal parts of my work in this archive, and how I was able to access Julius Eastman's story as well. And it almost, like, I think when we spoke about it earlier, it almost became like just points of matter, which are all just like these genderless things floating around and connecting when there needs to be a connection. But again, it's kind of like, to be totally uncomfortable, to be uncomfortable, to exist with so many other things that exist as uncomfortable. I think it has to almost be genderless and faceless in a way. And again, it's almost like a meditation as well, or a mantra, which I guess kind of felt like a mantra as well. As the more I was shedding, you could hear how desperate the came, the rebirth, reborn, all these different things. And it's the kind of like disrupting the ego in a way as well. So again, it's like Eastman and me are in the middle, and there's so many things like swirling around it. And yeah.
And so much I'd like to ask you based on that response. So sorry we don't have time, but I mean, it really sort of makes me, maybe I can just sort of put a few things into the air. And so, I mean, one thing actually, I mean, what you just said there about this sort of this notion of genderlessness makes me wonder about the sort of the affect and influence that such a position has on the creation of an archive, in a sense, because as we've seen in the work that's sort of been made available as part of Audiograph, there is a sort of a really stunning proclivity for the analogue in relation to the archive. And I was wondering about the sort of, the fluctuating and fluid nature of these positions of the digital and the analog, and whether there's something you might like to speak about there in relation to the sort of the cultivation of an archive, but also the how to sustain such a thing in relation to these two seemingly disparate modes of archiving, and yet modes that nevertheless, in this kind of position, actually begin to feed into one another and help sustain each other in their vastly different methods of production and creation.
Yeah. So initially, the archive was like, you know, when I was, you know, piecing it all together and finally putting it out of my body and like into a page, it was like, okay, the only way I could see this working was analog. You know, this needs to be a physical space. This needs to be, you know, bricks and mortar almost. It needs to contain, there is a Dandelion zine as well, and it is a physical zine, and like tapes and you know, a lot of I think most of the vocal works I did for Audiograph for the archive was with a tape recorder, and they are tapes, which is a pain in the ass to to get onto digital. But it's that thing again of Blackness and having something tangible at our fingertips. You know, so many, I think it relates even far back to, you know, 40 Acres and a Mule, like that kind of like really physical thing that of deserving of, you know, finally being able to rest in a space of having something. And not to say that this resembles any way 40 Acres and a Mule, but again, for me, that feels like having something tangible for this community, the community of the Dandelion Project, feels super important. But of course, one other things are at play here with like funding and so many other things. How can the essence of that be preserved in a digital setting as well? And again, I think it was done quite well on Audiograph's website as well. Like these were all analog things that I'm sure had a similar feeling of just by the way they looked. You know, it was film photographs. It was like etchings for the scores. It was all very physical things that have been offered in a digital space. So I think it's that feeling is obviously there, and I think it goes on to that again, entering like hauntology, sonic hauntology territories as well. That we probably don't have time for to go into. But again, yeah, like that. I think it was great to see it come together on Audiograph, because it was seeing that it is possible. And of course, I think the physical space for the archive will exist in the future, but right now it exists in both worlds on our screens right now, and that's also just as important because it still exists at the end of the day.
It's so funny you bring that up, because I did actually really want to ask you about sonic hauntology in this context. I mean, I think you may be right, maybe there isn't time. I don't know. Maybe we should make time, but well, before we open this out to any questions people in the audience might have, I guess we have two, in my mind at least, we have sort of, we're at a fork in the road where I'd love to hear about being pointed in the direction of the work of Eastman, but also work about Eastman that you would recommend to others. And also, you know, I mean, I really feel like we obviously need to make time for this next question about what sort of things we can be doing to help avoid such things happening to Black composers in the future. You know, such things that you've encountered time and time again, not only, of course, in relation to your work on Eastman, but in particular.
I think for the last question, I think a huge process of decolonizing classical music as a whole, which will naturally make way for composers like Julius Eastman even within the curriculum, because I mean, I haven't studied classical music, but from what I've known, like when I was doing my dissertation for my BA and having conversations with people and researching what exists there, it almost feels like there is no space for Blackness within this realm. And what I'm researching outside of this, but also within the context of this project, is Black classical composers' pre-colonial music and the influences that has on post-colonial classical music of Black composers, and the lending of traditional West African rhythms and melodies that are into this music as well. Why isn't there a space for that in the curriculum? It's like there's this huge chunk of erasure, and I think once that's acknowledged, once there's a shedding of what's acceptable in classical music, it has this very strange elitist white foundation. Once that's dismantled, which is an act of decolonizing, then I think it will make it easier for Black composers way before Eastman to be accessed and spoken about and studied and celebrated.
I think that's a good point at which to potentially open this out to any questions, if you're okay with that, Rebekah. If anyone does have anything they'd like to, or indeed if someone has asked something that I haven't seen. So, okay, shall I read this question out? Yeah, okay, so this is from Hannah. You spoke about the discomfort within your creative process and the feeling of shedding parts of yourself. This sounds like an incredibly intense and personal experience. How does it then feel for you to share, gift, release your music to an audience where you can't control how they might listen to your music or how they might receive your sounds on their own personal level?
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah. I think it's, yeah, I think it's definitely an uncomfortable process because, again, yeah, it is a deeply personal thing. I'm not coming into this as a researcher, as an academic in any way. This is my own experience, and I've been incredibly lucky to find Julius Eastman where it attaches to my being in every sense of that word. But I think in that shedding, I had to shed, you know, like I said before, briefly, it was like a shedding of the ego. And I think that comes with how I want people to listen to this. I think the biggest step for me was sharing it and getting it out there, and using my voice, which is something I didn't do before at all. But it felt like something I had to do because of how personal it was. But because of that shedding, I've had to be comfortable with it being perceived differently, and I think I'm enjoying it now. I'm enjoying having these sorts of conversations and hearing where people are coming of it, because I've almost made myself during that shedding process a vessel for whatever is to come for this, because archiving is like a cyclical, like ongoing thing. Decolonizing is an ongoing thing, and I think once it's opened up, I'm just open to being influenced and influencing, and yeah, so I think the short version of that is like, I'm now that I've shedded so much, I'm excited for how it will touch people in their own personal way and how it relates to themselves or what they're experiencing in their life, no matter who you are. Yeah, I think now that's an interest, whereas before it was a deeply insular process. Yeah, so I hope that answers your question, Hannah.
And there's also one from James here, who asks, what kind of physical artifacts will feature in your archive, and how would you like artists to access them?
Yeah, well, at the moment, I think the archive looks like how it does on the Audiograph website, where I have the physical artifacts of like the tapes, the scores, the zines, and all of these things. But then, yeah, how they'll feature on a digital platform is like scans and from analog to digital recordings, and there will be a system of maybe like dates or types of music in that realms of experimental and classical, visual, and the interplay between the two as well. And yeah, they should be accessed on a website that will hopefully soon come once an order has been made, and yeah, that's it for the moment. And then of course the more physical thing, which will come later, will just be what it is on the website, but you can touch it, you can put it in the player yourself. And I think it's going to be that open where you can touch these things. I don't like it when you go to places and you can't touch anything. Like the score that I made, a score for noise, which is on the Audiograph website, it's a score of noise, and I've like etched it in with like a knife. And of course, I'd love for people to touch that and feel that where that goes and what that might sound like for them. So it'll be a very physical thing, but in a different way. And of course, we have the zine. I've got like the Dandelion zine, which is, again, I made a film about Julius Eastman and classical music, which was kind of a more physical version of that film. But then I think the second zine will be more of this, like of these conversations that we're having. For example, me going into detail about the gender and the voice, and having more scores in there as well, which would be a very physical thing. So, where it rests in the digital world, the zine will always exist in a physical form that you can flick through and touch, etc., etc. Yeah.
Thank you, Rebekah. It's so fascinating. And I was wondering, unless there are more questions, so you mentioned the film you made, and we have an excerpt of that on the Audiograph website. So I don't know whether now might be a nice time.
Yeah, this is a great time
to sort of play a bit of that.
Yeah, we can play that. So yeah, this excerpt of the film, I believe, is the last to middle section of the film, which is basically Eastman speaking in his own words about I wouldn't say anything in particular, but it's definitely important. It's just hearing his voice, and what I've done is I've taken it again, realms of hauntology of the repetition and what we're working with here, which is like a severely analog thing of even in the spoken introduction with like the way it's like jumping and flickering and stuff. In the present day has it means so much more. It means the context maybe changes slightly. So yeah, this is the black and white of the only footage of Julius Eastman to exist, of him kind of like dancing around, and then him talking in his voice. Yeah.
Yes. I live in the world. I live in the world.
I like to write.
In the world. I live in the world. Hallelujah.
Yes. I just live like a wandering monk. Of sensuous delights. I love sensuality.
I love to love. I love to love.
Yes, I do.
I love to love. Oh, pleasant love.
You know, I have been fighting with the Lord for a long time.
Oh, love. Oh, love, let me rest in peace.
You know, I mean, I guess I would if somebody really wanted it. Not that many people, you know, are just banging down my door for this or for that. So I usually imagine it in music, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
But the things that I do usually sing are spontaneous. Spontaneous. I just worship the pure essence. I don't mess around with anything else. I think that those who hear can hear it, what I'm trying to say. I think that those who hear can hear it, what I'm trying to say.
Right.
The
Nice.
It's so lovely to sit and watch that with you all. There's so much more I'd like to say, but I guess that's a good place to end, unless, Rebekah, you have anything else you'd like to say?
No, that's a great place to end. Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah,
no, thank you for everything, Rebekah. This has been really, I mean, I look forward to more, much more. I mean, there's so much more to do. And yeah, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maya, James, Daniela, for having us. And thank you especially to Rebekah. Can't say enough.
Yeah. Have a good day, everyone.